The plane's wheels touched down with a soft thud, and my heart leapt like it used to when Daniel was little, and I'd hear his footsteps running toward me after school. I pressed my wrinkled hand against the small window, watching the city blur beneath me. Tall buildings, bright roofs, wide highways. A place far different from the quiet neighborhood I'd lived in for the past 40 years. My son had made it here, I told myself. He'd built a life grander than anything I could have dreamed of. I clutched the gift basket on my lap, filled with homemade cookies, a jar of my raspberry jam, and a framed photo of him as a boy sitting on my shoulders. That picture had always been his favorite. He used to say, "Mom, you carried the world for me." That memory made me smile, though my throat tightened around the joy. The flight attendant's voice interrupted, announcing our arrival. As people unbuckled their belts and rushed into the aisle, I stayed seated for a moment longer. My knees ached, and so did my heart, not from pain, but from the weight of love. When I finally stood, I felt the stiffness of age in my bones, but also a small spark of excitement. I was 67 now, and this trip was the longest journey I'd made alone since my husband passed. Daniel had insisted I come. His text had read, "Mom, it's time you see where we live now. You'll love it." I had read those words over and over until my eyes blurred. Maybe finally he wanted me close again. At the airport, the cold air bit my face as I stepped outside. I spotted his car, sleek and silver, nothing like the old rusted sedan he once drove when we used to go grocery shopping together after his college classes. The door opened, and there he was. My Daniel. My heart fluttered at the sight of him, tall and clean-shaven, wearing a crisp white shirt and an expensive watch that glinted under the sunlight. "Mom!" he called, smiling. For a moment, everything felt normal. I hurried toward him, my old brown suitcase wobbling behind me, and reached out for a hug. But when my arms wrapped around him, his grip was brief, polite. He smelled of cologne and distance. "You look great," I said, studying his face, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw. "You've lost weight." He nodded, looking around as though searching for someone. "Yeah, work's been crazy lately. Come on, the car's right here." I noticed he didn't take my suitcase. I didn't mind. Or at least, I told myself I didn't. The drive from the airport felt longer than it probably was. He talked about his promotion, about how the company was expanding, about real estate and investments, words I didn't fully follow. I nodded and smiled in the right places, but my thoughts kept wandering to simpler times, when he'd talk about soccer games, exams, or the girl he liked. The city grew quieter as we drove. Then the scenery changed. Trees lined the road, houses grew bigger, fences taller, lawns greener. A gated community loomed ahead with polished stone walls and uniformed guards in dark suits. The security man waved him in. "This is it," Daniel said, his voice proud. "Windsor Hills." I peered out the window. Every house looked like it had been cut from a magazine. Wide porches, trimmed hedges, expensive cars in the driveways, and in that perfection, something inside me shrank a little. "It's beautiful," I whispered. He smiled briefly. "Yeah, Lydia loves it. We wanted something respectable." Respectable. The word pricked like a thorn. When we turned into his driveway, I saw a house that looked more like a hotel. Cream walls, glass doors, a marble staircase visible through the window. My reflection stared back at me in the car window. A small, aging woman in a knitted cardigan, holding a basket of homemade cookies. I straightened my shoulders, trying to match the elegance of my surroundings. The front door opened before we even reached it. Lydia appeared, poised, stunning, wearing a silk blouse and a pearl necklace that caught the morning light. Her smile was practiced, not warm. "Margaret." "Finally," she said, her tone polite but rushed. "We've been waiting." "Daniel, Bring her in. Don't just stand there." Her eyes flickered to my worn shoes, then back up with a thin smile. Inside, everything gleamed. Polished floors, modern art, glass tables. I suddenly felt like I was walking through someone else's dream. I placed the gift basket on the counter and said softly, "I brought you some of my jam, dear. You used to love it." Lydia blinked. "Oh, that's sweet. We don't really eat much jam, but thank you." I laughed quietly to fill the silence. When Daniel offered to give me a quick tour, I followed him up the grand staircase. My eyes caught every detail, the walls lined with family photos. Only they weren't the family I knew. There were none of me. Not even the graduation photo where I stood beside him in my faded blue dress. I stopped walking, my hand on the railing. "You've redecorated." "Yeah," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Lydia thought it'd be good to start fresh." Start fresh. The phrase stung. Fresh from what? From me? Before I could say more, laughter echoed from outside. Through the window, I saw a couple of neighbors chatting near their driveways, waving toward us. Daniel stiffened slightly. Then, with a strained smile still plastered on his face, he leaned close, so close I could feel the tremor in his breath, and whispered something that turned my excitement into a chill. "Mom, please don't tell the neighbors you're my mother." The words dropped like stones in my chest. I froze, unsure if I'd heard correctly. My hand trembled as I clutched the railing. His smile didn't fade, but his eyes begged me to comply. And in that perfect house, surrounded by everything I'd once wished for him, I felt more unwanted than ever before. For a long moment, I just stood there, my fingers gripping the polished banister, as if it could anchor me to something steady. The air between us grew thick with silence. Daniel's smile stayed fixed, the kind of smile people wear when they're pretending everything is fine. "Mom," he murmured again, softer this time, "please, it's just complicated here. Complicated." I wanted to ask what could be so complicated about being a mother, but his tone, half pleading, half warning, made me swallow my words. The neighbors' laughter drifted through the window again, light and casual, like music from a world I no longer belonged to. "All right," I whispered. My voice cracked, but I tried to make it sound calm. "Of course." He exhaled with relief, as though I had just saved him from disaster. That hurt more than the words themselves. Lydia's voice called from downstairs. "Dinner's almost ready." I took a deep breath and followed Daniel down, my steps heavy on the marble floor. The dining room was lit by a chandelier that shimmered like falling stars. The table was already set, fine china, polished silverware, glasses that looked too delicate to touch. Lydia moved gracefully around the table, adjusting plates that were already perfectly aligned. "Everything looks beautiful," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Thank you," she replied. "We're having a few people over tonight, just neighbors. They've been wanting to meet us." I hesitated. "Oh, should I?" "Oh no, please stay," Lydia said quickly. "It'll be nice to have family here." Her words were kind, but her eyes said something else, something wary, as if she was afraid I might say the wrong thing or not fit in. I forced a smile and sat quietly in the corner of the living room as she lit the candles on the table. Through the wide glass doors, I saw the neighborhood glowing under the golden evening light. Couples strolled past with wine glasses, their laughter soft and easy. Every house looked perfect, every person well-dressed, every smile carefully measured. And then they began to arrive. First, a tall man in a navy blazer and his wife in pearls. Lydia greeted them with air kisses. Then another couple with matching watches, their perfume filling the air. I stood when Daniel introduced me, clutching my hands together. "This is Margaret," he said. She's family." "Family? Not my mother, just family." The woman smiled politely. "Lovely to meet you. Visiting from out of town?" "Yes," I said softly. from a little place by the lake. Been there most of my life." "Oh, how quaint," she said, as if describing an antique shop. I nodded, pretending not to notice Daniel's nervous glance. Dinner began with laughter. Theirs, not mine. They talked about property values, vacations, the new golf club opening nearby. I smiled and nodded when someone looked my way, but no one asked me anything beyond polite curiosity. "Daniel tells us he's moving up at the firm," one man said, slicing into his steak. Lydia's smile widened. "Yes, he's worked so hard for it." I wanted to say how proud I was, how I used to iron his shirts before every interview, how he'd study by candlelight when our power was cut off, but I stayed quiet. He didn't need me to tell those stories here. When the wine came around, Lydia poured some into my glass. "Just a little," she said sweetly. "I remember you don't drink much." I wanted to laugh, not at her words, but at how carefully everything was being managed. The table, the food, the conversation, even me. Halfway through dinner, a man across the table smiled at me. "So, Margaret, how are you related to Daniel and Lydia?" My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Before I could answer, Daniel spoke quickly. "Oh, she's an aunt of mine, from my dad's side." The room went silent for a beat, just long enough for me to feel my heart drop. An aunt. The metal fork slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered against the plate. Everyone glanced up, startled. I forced a small laugh, my cheeks burning. "Sorry," I said. "Clumsy hands." Daniel gave me a quick look, apologetic, desperate. Lydia filled the silence with chatter about the new community center. The conversation moved on, but my appetite was gone. I looked down at my plate and saw my reflection in the silver knife. A stranger at her own son's table. When dinner ended, Lydia gathered the guests in the living room for coffee. I excused myself, saying I was tired from the flight. Nobody insisted I stay. As I climbed the stairs, the voices below faded into muffled laughter. My heart ached with every step. At the top, I turned toward the hallway, lined with photographs of Daniel and Lydia, smiling beside important-looking people, vacationing in places I'd never seen. Not one photo of us. I stopped at the end of the hall, where a blank space hung on the wall, the perfect size for a picture frame. Maybe one used to hang there. Maybe it was mine. I pressed my fingers to that empty space, tracing its faint outline. My eyes stung. I whispered to no one. "You told them I was your aunt." The words sounded smaller than I expected. Inside the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed, unzipping my suitcase. The smell of lavender sachets drifted up. I'd packed them because Daniel used to say they reminded him of home. I reached for the framed photo I'd brought, the one of him as a boy with his arms around my neck. His little face beamed with pride. I placed it on the bedside table and stared at it for a long time. "I guess we both grew up," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Just not in the same direction." Through the open window, the sound of laughter floated up again. Daniel's laughter among the others. I smiled bitterly. In that moment, I realized something painful. Love can make you blind, but shame can make others forget you ever existed. I turned off the lamp, but the darkness didn't hide the tears that followed. I barely slept that night. The laughter downstairs faded long ago, but its echo still rang in my ears, cheerful, careless, as if I were never there. I sat upright on the bed, watching the faint shimmer of moonlight fall across the polished floor. Every shadow in that room seemed to whisper the same words over and over. "Don't tell the neighbors you're my mom." They looped in my mind like a broken lullaby, one I couldn't turn off no matter how hard I tried. I pressed my palms together and tried to steady my breathing. How could something so small, a single sentence, slice so deep? I'd lived through loss, poverty, even widowhood, but never this, never the pain of being erased by the very life I helped create. The house was silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I stood and walked toward the dresser where the photograph I'd brought sat beside the lamp. Daniel was 8 in that picture, missing a front tooth, freckles sprinkled across his nose. We'd taken it on his first day of school after his father's death. He had refused to smile that morning until I promised him pancakes for dinner. I looked at that child now and wondered, if he saw the man he'd become, would he still smile? I sat by the window, watching faint clouds drift across the moon. Outside, the manicured lawns gleamed under streetlights. Everything looked so perfect, so painfully perfect. I thought about all the times Daniel and I had sat together in our tiny apartment, counting coins to pay the rent, laughing anyway. Back then, the floor was uneven, the walls cracked, but our hearts were steady. I remembered working night shifts at the hospital cafeteria, scrubbing pots until my fingers bled, while Daniel waited at home, doing homework at the kitchen table. Sometimes he'd stay up late, his little head resting on a pile of books, just to say goodnight when I walked in. He used to tell me, "One day I'll buy you a big house, Mom. You won't have to lift a finger." And here we were. He had done exactly that, a big house, except there was no space for me in it. My eyes drifted to the hallway. The faint glow from the nightlight cast a soft beam across the empty picture hooks. I stepped out quietly and walked down the corridor, my feet cold against the marble floor. The walls felt taller, the silence heavier. Halfway down, I stopped at the family photo wall again. Rows of framed smiles stared back. Daniel and Lydia on vacations, Daniel with his colleagues, Daniel with Ethan. The frames shimmered in the light like trophies. I scanned each one slowly, hoping, praying that somewhere, maybe hidden in a corner, there would be one, just one, that included me. But there wasn't. Not even the one from his wedding, where I'd worn my best blue dress, sitting at the end of the table so I wouldn't block anyone's view. Even that moment had been edited out. I reached out and touched one frame, Daniel in his graduation gown. I remembered sitting in the bleachers that day, holding a cheap bouquet of flowers, crying when they called his name. He'd waved to me, beaming, shouting, "I did it, Mom!" Now the photo showed him alone. It was as if I'd been written out of his story. When I returned to the room, the air felt different, colder somehow. I sat back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. My heart felt like it was being wrung dry, one twist at a time. Was this what all my years had led to? Working through fevers, skipping meals so he could eat, pretending I wasn't tired so he wouldn't feel guilty? I closed my eyes and saw flashes of the past. Daniel as a little boy, standing on a chair, helping me wash dishes. Daniel crying over a scraped knee. Daniel handing me a paper heart on Mother's Day that said, "Best mom in the world." When did that boy disappear? When did love turn into shame? A tear slipped down my cheek, landing softly on the blanket. I whispered to the quiet room, "You could have told them I was your mother. You didn't have to be proud, just honest." The words trembled as they left my lips. I wiped my face and tried to calm myself, but the ache wouldn't fade. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally lay down. My body was exhausted, but my mind was alive with memories that wouldn't let me rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him at the door, whispering those words. I thought about calling him up right then, waking him, demanding to know why. But I couldn't. The fear of hearing more truth, of hearing him confirm what I already suspected, stopped me. He was ashamed of me. Not because of anything I'd done, but because of who I was. Because I wasn't polished enough, rich enough, young enough to fit into his perfect new world. And somehow, I still loved him. That was the cruelest part of all. Around 3 a.m., I finally got up, too restless to stay in bed. I opened my suitcase and began to fold the clothes I'd brought, neatly, slowly, deliberately. Each fold felt like a small goodbye. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. I didn't want a scene. I didn't want pity. I just wanted peace. As I packed, something slipped out of my bag, a small crocheted scarf, pale yellow. I'd made it years ago for Ethan when he was a baby. I smiled faintly as I ran my fingers over the soft yarn. Maybe, I thought, I could at least say goodbye to him before leaving. Then I'd go home, back to my quiet house by the lake where no one judged my shoes or my wrinkles, a place where love had once lived honestly, even if it was poor. I placed the scarf carefully on top of the suitcase and zipped it shut. The sound was small, but final. Then I turned off the lamp and whispered into the dark, if being his mother makes him ashamed, I'll stop reminding him. But as I lay back down, another thought slipped through the cracks of my heartbreak, soft, hesitant, and alive. Maybe one day he'll remember. And with that fragile hope, I closed my eyes, unaware that the next morning would bring someone unexpected to my door. Someone small, curious, and far more honest than any adult in that house. Morning arrived too soon. The sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, soft and golden, but it felt intrusive, like it didn't belong here, in this coldly perfect house. I sat at the edge of the bed, my packed suitcase beside me, my heart heavy with indecision. I told myself I'd leave before anyone woke up. I even picked up the photo frame, ready to tuck it back into my bag. But then a gentle knock came at the door. "Mom?" Daniel's voice, calm, controlled, the kind of voice people use in meetings, not with their mothers. I hesitated. "Come in." He stepped inside, already dressed in a pressed shirt, smelling faintly of cologne and fresh coffee. "You're up early," he said, his tone casual. "I thought you might like to have breakfast before we go out." "Go out?" I asked quietly. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Lydia thought it'd be nice for you to come to a little neighborhood lunch today. Just a few close friends. Nothing big." I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell him that after last night I had no appetite for pretense, but I couldn't bear to make things worse. Not yet. So, I smiled faintly. "Of course. I'll come." By noon, the dining room had transformed again. Lydia moved about briskly in her pale pink dress, arranging flowers and polishing wine glasses. The smell of roasted chicken and buttered rolls filled the air. She noticed me hovering near the kitchen doorway and smiled politely. "Oh, you look lovely," she said. Her eyes flickered down to my simple blue dress, the same one I'd worn to Daniel's graduation. "Very classic." "Thank you," I said softly. Guests began to arrive. Laughter, perfume, polite greetings. The same couples from the night before, plus a few new faces. I took a seat at the far end of the long table, beside a little vase of lilies. Daniel poured wine for the guests, his posture confident and composed. Every gesture of his was careful, deliberate, the polished version of my boy, trained for this world. Lydia raised a toast, to friends, family, and new beginnings. Everyone clinked glasses. I lifted mine halfway, but didn't drink. The lunch unfolded like a stage play. Laughter at the right moments, compliments over the food, polite nods at stories I couldn't relate to. I felt invisible, which was almost a relief. Almost. Then, halfway through the meal, one of the neighbors leaned toward Lydia. "We've been meaning to ask. Is this your mother?" She gestured toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Daniel froze for half a heartbeat. His fork hovered over his plate. Lydia's lips parted, but Daniel answered first. Too quickly. No, she's, my aunt. From my father's side." The same lie, delivered with the same smoothness. But this time there was no noise to cover the silence that followed. The man nodded politely. "Ah, I see. Well, you do have the same eyes." I wanted to disappear. I wanted to melt into the chair, into the floor, into anything that wasn't this suffocating embarrassment. I smiled, small and brittle, and murmured, "That's kind of you." Inside, my heart screamed. As dessert was served, conversation turned to childhood stories. Someone joked about their parents being too old-fashioned. Laughter rippled around the table. Daniel laughed too. I looked at him. Really looked. The way his hand rested lightly on Lydia's arm, the way he leaned into conversations about business and property, nodding like he belonged. And maybe he did. Maybe this was the life he'd fought for, one where mothers who wore cardigans and brought homemade jam simply didn't fit. When Lydia caught my gaze, she smiled awkwardly. There was guilt there, somewhere behind her eyes. But she said nothing. After lunch, we all moved to the patio for coffee. The air was fresh, scented with blooming jasmine and trimmed grass. The neighborhood looked almost like a painting, not a leaf out of place. I sat quietly on the edge of a cushioned chair, watching Ethan chase bubbles across the lawn. His laughter was pure, unfiltered, the one sound that didn't feel rehearsed. He ran up to me, breathless, and climbed into my lap. "Grandma, look, I can catch them!" My heart stopped. Everyone heard it. The word hung in the air. Grandma. Lydia's smile faltered. Daniel's cup froze midair. The neighbors exchanged curious looks. "Grandma," one woman repeated. "Oh, I didn't realize—" Daniel laughed awkwardly, setting his cup down. "Oh, he calls everyone Grandma. It's a family joke." Ethan frowned. "No, she's my real grandma. Daddy, you said—" "Ethan," Daniel interrupted sharply, "why don't you go play with your friends?" The boy slid off my lap, confused and hurt. My arms felt suddenly cold without his warmth. The adults quickly resumed their chatter, pretending not to notice. But the damage was done. The lie had cracked in front of everyone. I sat there staring at my trembling hands. My son couldn't even bear for the truth to exist, not from his child's lips, not from mine. I excused myself quietly. "I'll go help in the kitchen." No one stopped me. Inside, I stood by the sink, pretending to rinse cups I couldn't see clearly through the blur of my tears. My reflection in the window looked small, old, tired. For a moment, I thought I saw Daniel behind me, his shadow in the reflection. But when I turned, no one was there. Only the faint sound of laughter again, drifting from outside, light and easy, like the night before. I gripped the counter and whispered to the quiet kitchen, "I raised you to be kind, not to be perfect." Then I reached for a towel, dried my hands, and walked upstairs to pack. This time I didn't hesitate. I didn't care if he noticed me leaving. But when I entered my room, my suitcase wasn't alone. Someone small had beaten me to it. Ethan sat on the floor beside it, clutching a crayon drawing. A crooked little house with flowers in front and a stick figure woman smiling by the door. Above it, in messy handwriting, he'd written, "Grandma's home." He looked up at me and whispered, "Daddy says you live far away. Can I come visit you there?" My throat tightened. I knelt beside him, smoothing his hair. "Of course, sweetheart, whenever you want." He smiled brightly, the only real smile I'd seen since arriving. And right then, I realized, even if Daniel was ashamed of me, his son wasn't. There was still one person in this world who saw me for who I really was. That night, the silence in the house felt different, heavier, more personal. It wasn't the stillness of peace. It was the stillness that follows humiliation when every breath feels like a reminder that you don't belong. I sat on the edge of the bed again, staring at the small crayon drawing Ethan had given me. Grandma's home. The words were crooked, the sun lopsided, the flowers uneven, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in years. I traced the edges of it with my finger, my throat tight. In that childish scrawl, I could feel the one thing this perfect house lacked: warmth. Ethan, with his innocent heart, had noticed what the adults refused to see. Downstairs, I heard the faint clinking of dishes, Lydia cleaning up after the guests. Daniel's voice murmured low, irritated. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I already knew they were arguing about me. I turned on the lamp, its light soft and golden. The walls glowed briefly before returning to their usual emptiness. My eyes scanned the hallway beyond my door, lined with those same flawless photos. None of me. Not even a shadow of who I used to be in his life. I couldn't bear it anymore. I stood and opened the door quietly, the wood creaking just enough to make me hesitate, but I stepped out anyway. The hallway was dim, only a faint nightlight at the far end casting a pale blue glow. My steps echoed softly as I walked past. The pictures. Daniel's life, neatly framed, carefully edited. I stopped at one near the middle. Daniel and Lydia holding baby Ethan, smiling for a Christmas photo. My hand hovered near it. I remembered being there that day. I had been the one behind the camera. I had cooked dinner, wrapped the gifts, and held Ethan between shots when he cried. But here, in this perfect photograph, I didn't exist. He had literally cropped me out. The air left my lungs in a shaky exhale. I leaned my forehead against the wall for a moment, whispering, "You can erase my face, but not my love." Then I turned back toward my room, each step slower than the last. I sat down by the window, staring out into the dark street. The rows of identical houses glowed faintly under lamplight, quiet, respectable, hollow. I thought of my old neighborhood back home. Small porches with peeling paint, flower pots hanging by rusty chains, neighbors who borrowed sugar and talked through fences. That world was gone, and maybe I was gone with it. Here, everything gleamed, but nothing felt alive. I rested my hands in my lap, remembering the years that led to this moment. All the nights I'd stayed up sewing his clothes because I couldn't afford new ones. The years I worked double shifts so he could go to university. The day he left home with nothing but a small suitcase and big dreams, and promised, "Mom, when I make it, I'll take care of you." He had kept his promise in the most literal way. I was in his house, but not in his life. And somehow, that hurt more than any poverty we ever knew. Tears came slowly, quietly. They rolled down my cheeks and disappeared into the folds of my hands. I didn't sob. I didn't scream. I was too old for dramatics, too used to swallowing pain. But inside, I was breaking. I whispered to the empty room, "You're ashamed of the woman who wiped your tears, Daniel, of the hands that fed you, of the name that raised you." The words felt strange on my tongue, almost foreign, maybe because I'd never allowed myself to say them before. I looked again at the drawing Ethan made. His little handwriting seemed to shine under the lamp. Grandma's home. And suddenly I knew I couldn't stay here. Not one more night under this roof where love had been replaced by performance. I would leave quietly before dawn. No confrontation, no tears in front of him. I had given enough already. I began to gather my things, slowly. The movement felt ceremonial, like closing a chapter. I folded my clothes neatly into the suitcase, tucked Ethan's drawing between my diary pages, and picked up the framed photo I had brought. When I turned it over, I noticed a small crack in the glass. Maybe from the flight, maybe from the way I'd clutched it too tightly the night before. Still, I smiled faintly. Even broken things can hold memories. As I zipped the suitcase, I heard a soft knock at the door. "Grandma?" My heart caught. Ethan's little voice again, fragile, uncertain. I opened the door quickly. He stood there in his pajamas, holding a flashlight and his stuffed bear. His eyes were sleepy, but worried. "Did Daddy make you sad?" he whispered. I knelt down, brushing the hair from his forehead. "No, sweetheart. Daddy's just busy being an adult." He frowned. "I heard him tell Mommy you don't fit in here." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. His words, innocent, unfiltered, hit harder than any insult. I forced a smile. Well, sometimes grown-ups forget that love doesn't have to fit anywhere. It just is. He didn't understand, but he nodded as if he did. Then he handed me a small folded paper. This is for you. Don't open it till you go home." I kissed his forehead. "Thank you, my darling boy." He hugged me tightly. "I love you, Grandma." Those words, pure and unashamed, filled the cracks his father had made. After he went back to bed, I sat there for a long time, holding that folded paper in my palm. I didn't open it. Not yet. I wanted to save the moment, that simple proof that love still lived somewhere in this house. Outside, dawn began to bloom faintly over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pale orange and soft gold. I looked at my suitcase, at the photograph, at the empty hallway beyond. It was time to leave. But something in my chest whispered, not in bitterness, but in quiet strength, "You're not leaving defeated. You're leaving with dignity." I stood, brushed the wrinkles from my dress, and whispered into the silence, "If my love embarrasses you, Daniel, then my absence will humble you." And with that, I turned off the lamp, letting the early light fill the room. Tomorrow I would be gone. But tonight, I reclaimed something I hadn't felt in years, my own worth. The morning light slipped through the curtains like a whisper, gentle gold and bitter-sweet. I had barely slept, though I must have closed my eyes for a little while. When I opened them, the room looked strangely peaceful, as if nothing had happened the night before. For a moment, I let myself pretend I was just visiting my son's family for a pleasant weekend, that we'd laugh over breakfast, and that he'd kiss my cheek like he used to before leaving for work. Pretend we were still the same people we used to be. But the packed suitcase by the door broke that illusion. Reality sat there, zipped and ready. I washed my face, brushed my hair, and took one last look at the room. It was spotless, elegant, and completely void of any trace of me. Even my scent would vanish after a day or two. With a sigh, I reached for my old shawl and draped it over my shoulders. The yarn was frayed from years of use, but it still carried warmth, the kind that money couldn't buy. I took a final glance around the room, whispered a quiet goodbye, and reached for the suitcase handle. That's when I heard it. A faint knock. "Grandma?" I froze. That little voice again. When I opened the door, Ethan stood there, still in his pajamas, his hair messy, his eyes wide with that same unfiltered honesty only children have. I knelt down. "Sweetheart, you're up early." He nodded and shuffled his feet. "I heard your suitcase. Are you going home?" I smiled softly. "Yes, darling, it's time for me to go." His little face fell. "But Daddy said you were staying." My chest tightened. "Your daddy has a lot on his mind. It's okay." He hesitated for a moment, looking down at the floor. "Daddy and Mommy were fighting last night," he said in a whisper, glancing toward the hallway to make sure no one was listening. "He said some bad things." I frowned gently. "What kind of bad things?" He looked up at me, his eyes suddenly shiny with confusion. "He said you embarrass him." Those words, small and soft from a child's mouth, hit harder than they should have. I felt the air leave my lungs, the same way it had when Daniel first whispered that I shouldn't tell the neighbors who I was. Still, I smiled. Because what else could I do? He was a child, innocent, honest, caught between two worlds that should have loved each other. I brushed his hair aside and said quietly, "Sometimes grown-ups say things they don't mean when they're trying too hard to fit in." He frowned. "Fit in where?" I smiled sadly. "In places that were never built for them." He didn't understand, not fully, but he listened, his little brow furrowed in thought. Then he took my hand, his small fingers curling around my wrinkled ones. "I'm sorry Daddy said that," he whispered. "I like you just how you are." My heart cracked open at that. Tears blurred my vision, and I hugged him tightly, breathing in that faint smell of milk and innocence. "Thank you, sweetheart," I murmured into his hair. "That means more to me than you'll ever know." He pulled back, smiling shyly. "I made you something." He reached into his pajama pocket and pulled out a folded paper. His little hand smoothed it out before handing it to me. Inside, he had drawn another picture, this time of a small house by the lake, with smoke rising from the chimney and a woman with gray hair watering flowers. Above it, he had written in big, uneven letters, "Grandma's real home." I covered my mouth, tears spilling freely now. "Oh, Ethan," he grinned, proud of his masterpiece. "Daddy said you used to have a house by the lake. I want to come there one day. Can I?" I swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, my love, anytime you want. It's not big like this one, but it has birds that sing in the morning and stars you can actually see at night." "Really?" His eyes sparkled. "Really?" Suddenly, we both froze as footsteps echoed down the hallway. Daniel's voice, groggy, impatient. "Ethan, what are you doing up so early?" Ethan's eyes widened in panic. "I have to go," he whispered. He darted into my room, kissed my cheek quickly, and whispered, "I love you, Grandma. Don't let Daddy make you sad." Then he ran off, his little feet pattering down the hallway before Daniel could turn the corner. I stood there for a moment, the folded drawing trembling in my hands. Then Daniel appeared, tall, composed, already irritated. "Mom, you're up early. I was going to drive you to the airport later." I kept my face calm. "No need. I've called a cab." He frowned. "You didn't have to do that. We can—" "Daniel." My voice was steady, quiet, but it made him pause. "You've done enough." He looked confused, maybe even guilty, but said nothing. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck, muttered something about a meeting, and turned away. When he was gone, I closed the door and exhaled. A deep, tired breath I didn't realize I'd been holding since I arrived. I placed Ethan's new drawing inside my travel bag, right next to the first one, 2 small pieces of paper holding more love than this entire mansion. As I zipped the bag, I whispered to myself, he might be ashamed of me, but his son isn't. And that thought, that tiny spark of hope, steadied me. Because for the first time in days, I realized something important. I couldn't change Daniel's heart, but I could protect my own. I wiped my tears, fixed my hair, and rolled my suitcase toward the door. The marble floor was cold beneath my feet, but the light spilling in from the hallway felt warm. As I passed the family photos one last time, I didn't feel erased anymore. I just felt done. Done trying to fit where I wasn't wanted. Done pretending silence was kindness. I stepped outside the house into the cool morning air, letting the sun touch my face. Behind me, a curtain fluttered, and for a brief second I thought I saw Ethan peeking through, waving his small hand. I smiled and waved back, whispering, "Goodbye, my brave boy. You reminded Grandma who she is." Then I turned toward the waiting cab. I didn't look back again. The taxi driver was late, so I decided to walk. It wasn't far to the main gate, and the morning was still cool, the kind of cool that makes the world feel freshly washed. I wheeled my suitcase behind me, its small wheels bumping softly over the perfect stone pavement. Every house I passed looked identical. White fences, trimmed hedges, silent cars gleaming in driveways. Everything spotless, everything lifeless. For a moment, I wondered if this was what Daniel wanted all along. Silence, control, approval. The kind of perfection that leaves no room for truth. The sun peeked through the leaves, scattering gold over the sidewalk. I stopped for a second, closing my eyes, letting the light warm my face. I hadn't realized how heavy my heart had become until the morning air touched it. It felt lighter out here, as if the shame that clung to those walls couldn't follow me past the gate. I could finally breathe. As I walked, a voice called out from behind me, "Leaving so soon, dear?" I turned. An older woman stood near her garden, watering bright pink roses. She wore a sun hat and a faded floral dress, her gray hair neatly tied back. Something about her, her unhurried movements, her easy posture, felt real in a place that had felt so artificial. I smiled politely. "Yes, I'm catching a flight soon." She set her watering can down and stepped closer. "I saw you at the gathering yesterday. You didn't seem to enjoy yourself much." I hesitated. "Oh, I'm not much for parties." She studied me with kind, knowing eyes, the kind of eyes that see through polite lies. "Ah," she said softly, "or maybe the company wasn't right." Her words startled me. For a moment, I thought of denying it, but something about her tone invited honesty. So I just smiled sadly and said, "Let's just say, sometimes you realize too late that love doesn't always come with respect." She nodded slowly, her lips curving into a faint, understanding smile. That's the hardest kind of lesson, isn't it? We stood there for a moment, the silence filled with birdsong and the gentle hiss of her garden hose. Finally, she asked, "Was that your son hosting yesterday?" I hesitated. "Yes." She tilted her head, almost gently. "He looks polished." But there was something sad in his eyes, like a man trying to remember who he used to be. Her observation cut deeper than she could have known. I looked down at the pavement. He's worked hard to build this life. Maybe too hard. She gave a small laugh. Not unkind, just weary. That's what they all say here. They come chasing comfort, and in the end, they build cages out of marble. I smiled faintly. "Cages out of marble," I repeated. "That's exactly what it feels like." She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at my suitcase. "You know," she said, "when my children moved away, I used to sit by that gate every morning waiting for a letter, a call, anything. Then one day I realized, love doesn't always come back the way you gave it. Sometimes you have to stop waiting and start living again." Her words landed softly, but they sank deep. "Start living again," I murmured. She smiled, patted my hand lightly, and said, "You seem like the kind of woman who's forgotten how strong she is. Don't stay that way too long." As the taxi finally pulled up by the curb, the driver, a young man, jumped out to help with my suitcase. I thanked the woman for her kindness. As I turned to leave, she called after me, "You'll be all right, dear. I can tell. You've already survived what breaks most hearts." Her words followed me into the car like a quiet blessing. From the back seat, I watched the gates of Windsor Hills disappear behind me, tall, proud, shutting me out as if to say, "You don't belong here." And for the first time, I realized I didn't want to. Belonging had cost too much. My pride, my presence, my place in my own son's life. The road opened wide ahead, free, winding, lined with trees. I rolled down the window and let the wind rush through, tugging gently at my gray hair. It carried the scent of something pure, dew, pine, maybe even the faintest hint of lake water in the distance. I smiled. The world beyond the gates felt alive again. When I reached the airport, I didn't rush. I sat by the window, sipping weak coffee, watching planes rise and vanish into the clouds. Each one carried people running towards something, or away from it. I wondered which I was doing. In my bag, the folded drawings Ethan made were tucked safely between my clothes. I took one out, the one labeled Grandma's Real Home. I traced the little chimney with my finger and whispered, "You'll come see me one day, my darling boy, and when you do, you'll know what home really feels like." For the first time in days, my chest didn't feel heavy. There was sorrow, yes, but also space. Room for air. Room for peace. By the time I boarded my flight, I'd made up my mind. I wouldn't go home and cry. I wouldn't wallow in what I'd lost. I would plant flowers by the lake again. I'd repaint the old porch, open the windows, bake bread like I used to. I'd fill my little cottage with laughter, not from guests, but from myself. And maybe one day, if Daniel came to his senses, the door would still be open. But until then, my heart would belong to the place and the people who still saw me for who I truly was. As the plane took off, the city shrank below me, and so did the weight I'd been carrying. I leaned my head against the window and whispered, almost to the clouds, "You may have forgotten who I am, Daniel, but I remember, and that's enough." 3 days passed before I finally began to feel the stillness settle inside me. Not the kind that hurts, but the kind that heals. The lake shimmered outside my window, its surface catching bits of sunlight like broken glass. The cottage was quiet, except for the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet and the distant sound of birds calling from the trees. It wasn't grand, it wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Every chipped tile, every uneven step, every memory soaked into the walls. I'd spent the morning cleaning, humming softly to myself. I opened the windows to let the breeze in and brewed a pot of tea, its scent of mint filling the air. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. And then I heard it. A car door. The sound sliced through the quiet like a blade. I froze. No one ever came here unannounced. I peeked through the curtain. A sleek black car was parked at the edge of the dirt path. For a second, my breath caught. Daniel. He stepped out, wearing a suit far too fine for this place, his shoes already gathering dust from the gravel. He looked out of place here, like a man who had wandered into the wrong story. I turned away from the window before he could see me watching. My heart thudded against my ribs, torn between anger and the ache of a mother who still wanted to believe her child might come home just to say, "I'm sorry." When I opened the door, he was already halfway up the porch steps. "Mom," he said, his voice low, careful. I didn't answer right away. I just stepped aside and nodded for him to come in. He hesitated before crossing the threshold, as if unsure he was allowed. Maybe he wasn't sure of much anymore. The house smelled of tea and old wood. His eyes darted around. The small fireplace, the faded curtains, the pictures on the mantel. Pictures of him as a boy, of us. He swallowed hard. "You still have these?" "Of course," I said simply, pouring tea into 2 cups. "Memories don't take up much space." He sat down slowly, his posture tense. "Mom, I shouldn't have let you leave like that." "Let me?" I repeated softly, sitting across from him. "You didn't let me do anything, Daniel. I walked out because I had to." He winced, lowering his gaze. "I know. His voice trailed off. "I made a mess of things." I said nothing. The clock on the wall ticked gently, filling the silence he didn't know how to escape. Finally, he spoke again. "The neighbors found out." I looked up. "About what?" "That you're my mother," he said quietly. "Ethan told one of the kids at school. It spread around. People started asking questions." A faint, bitter smile touched my lips. "Ah, so that's why you're here." "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I mean, yes, but not like that. I realized I was wrong about everything. I thought I was protecting you, Mom. I didn't want anyone to judge." I cut him off gently. "You weren't protecting me, Daniel. You were protecting yourself." He opened his mouth to protest, but I raised a hand. "You were ashamed," I continued, my tone calm but unwavering. "Ashamed of where you came from, ashamed of the woman who scrubbed floors and packed your lunch in reused containers. You thought that hiding me would make you belong." His eyes glistened. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," I said softly. "You meant every word when you asked me not to tell the neighbors who I was. You meant it when you called me your aunt." He lowered his head, voice trembling. "I was scared, Mom. I worked so hard to get where I am. People in that world, they look at everything. How you talk, how you dress. I didn't want them to think less of me." I stared at him for a long moment. "And did they respect you more for lying?" He didn't answer. I leaned back in my chair, my hands wrapped around the warm cup. "You know," I said quietly, "I used to pray that you'd grow up strong, not rich, not important, just strong. Strong enough to be kind, Strong enough to tell the truth. He looked up, his voice cracking. I failed you. I took a breath, steady and slow. No, Daniel, you failed yourself. Tears slipped down his cheeks, and for a second I saw my little boy again. The one who used to cry when he broke something, the one who'd climb into my lap for comfort. But that boy was buried under years of fear and pride. I'm sorry, he whispered. I can't change what I said, but I want to make it right. I studied him. The fine watch on his wrist, the expensive shoes dusted with earth, the face that carried both arrogance and regret. Do you even know what right means anymore? I asked softly. It's not buying me a bigger house or saying sorry because your reputation is at risk. It's remembering who you are when no one's watching. He wiped his eyes. Silent. I stood and walked to the window, staring out at the lake. The water rippled softly, reflecting the sun. Do you remember when we used to come here on weekends? I said. You'd throw stones into the water and tell me you wanted to see how far they'd skip. You used to say each ripple meant your dream was coming true. He nodded, voice barely audible. I remember. I turned to face him. Your dreams came true, Daniel, but you forgot who threw the first stone with you. He covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice muffled. I don't deserve forgiveness. I walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. You're right, you don't, but you'll get it anyway, because that's what mothers do. We forgive even when our hearts are still bleeding. He looked up, tears shining in his eyes. Can you ever trust me again? I sighed, my voice quiet but firm. Forgiveness is easy, Daniel. Trust has to be rebuilt, slowly, patiently, one truth at a time. He nodded, swallowing hard. We sat in silence after that, listening to the faint hum of the wind through the open window. Then, almost in a whisper, I said, Your son, Ethan, he's a good boy. Don't let him grow up thinking love is something to be hidden. Daniel nodded again, his eyes full of guilt and longing. He loves you, Mom. He talks about you every night. A soft ache filled my chest. Not pain, not anger, but something gentler. I smiled faintly. Then maybe there's hope for both of you. When he left, I stood on the porch and watched him drive away. The dust rose behind his car, then settled again, leaving the air still and clear. The lake shimmered in the distance, calm and endless. I whispered into the breeze, You can come back when you remember that love isn't something to hide. And for the first time, I didn't cry, because now I wasn't broken. I was free. After Daniel left, the silence he left behind was different. It wasn't the sharp, lonely quiet of rejection. It was gentler now, almost cleansing. I sat by the window for a long while, watching the dust settle on the road he'd driven away on. The lake shimmered beyond the trees, calm and forgiving, as if it understood that endings could sometimes be a kind of mercy. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and tried to steady my breath. The confrontation had taken something out of me, not just tears, but years of weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. For the first time in what felt like decades, I'd spoken every truth I had buried, and though it had hurt, it also felt holy. Like opening a window in a room that had been closed too long. Still, my hands trembled. You can forgive your child, but the ache never fully leaves. It just learns to live quietly in your chest. By late afternoon, the house was glowing with the soft light of sunset. I made myself another cup of tea, strong and earthy, and stepped out onto the porch. The breeze smelled of pine and lake water. I thought I'd spend the evening here, maybe write in my old journal, maybe just listen to the crickets. But when I returned inside, I noticed something strange on the kitchen table. An envelope. My name was written on it in delicate handwriting. Margaret. The paper was cream-colored. the kind that comes from expensive stationery. My pulse quickened. Daniel hadn't left it. He didn't write like that. I turned the envelope over. It wasn't sealed, just folded neatly. I opened it carefully and began to read. Dear Margaret, you don't know how many times I've wanted to reach out to you, but Daniel always said it wasn't the right time. I know that's not an excuse, it's just the truth. The last few days have made me see things more clearly than I ever have before. I've watched how he speaks to you and how you quietly accept it. I've seen your eyes when he calls you family instead of mother. It broke me too. Not because you deserve that, but because I've let it happen. I didn't have the courage to stand up to him. I thought I was protecting our life, our image, our son. But I see now, all we've protected is our pride. There's something I think you should know. Something Daniel never told you. He bought a small cottage years ago before we moved to Windsor Hills. He said it was an investment, but I know it was meant for you. He said one day when things were settled, he'd give it to you. But then, he never did. I think he couldn't face what that meant. The deed is enclosed in this envelope. It's in your name. I believe it's yours, Margaret. Truly yours. Please don't hate him forever. He's lost in a world that rewards masks, but you've stayed real. And I envy that more than anything. If you ever forgive him, or me, I'll be grateful. If not, I'll understand. With respect and love, Lydia. By the time I reached the end of the letter, my hands were trembling. The deed fell onto the table, a neat rectangle of official paper with my name printed clearly across the top. Margaret Dawson. For a long time, I just stared at it, my heart thudding like a drum. A cottage? Bought for me? Hidden all these years? I pressed my palm flat against the document, almost expecting it to vanish. My son, the same man who had erased me from his walls, had secretly set aside a place with my name on it. Why? Guilt? Fear? Love he couldn't show? It didn't matter. Whatever the reason, that paper felt like a map, a quiet invitation to rediscover something that had been taken from me, belonging. The next morning, I set out early. The address was only 2 towns away, a quiet stretch of countryside near the river's bend. The road grew narrower as I drove, until it was just dirt and grass, flanked by rows of tall wildflowers swaying in the breeze. When I reached the end of the lane, I stopped. There it was. A small wooden cottage sat beneath a canopy of old oak trees. The paint was peeling, the roof a little sun-faded, but it had a soul. The kind of place that whispered of mornings, filled with coffee and evenings with stories. The porch creaked as I climbed the steps. My hand shook as I turned the old brass doorknob. It opened easily, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through the windows. But beneath the dust, I saw them, boxes, dozens of them, each one labeled in neat handwriting, Mom's Things. I opened the nearest one. Inside lay my handmade quilt, the one I'd thought lost years ago. Another held my old photo albums, my favorite teacups, the worn recipe cards Daniel used to beg me to make cookies from. And then tucked between 2 boxes, I found something that made my knees weaken. A birthday card, faded and yellowed at the edges. It read, "To the best mom in the world, I'll buy you a house one day. Love, Danny, age 10. Tears fell before I even knew they were coming. I sank onto the dusty floor, clutching that old card to my chest. Maybe Daniel had lost his way. Maybe pride had built walls between us. But somewhere, buried deep beneath the marble, the lies, the fear, the little boy who once promised me a house still existed. I spent the rest of the afternoon opening boxes, breathing in old memories. The air smelled like dust, wood, and something I hadn't felt in years, home. When the sun began to set, I stepped out onto the porch, looking across the fields. A single thought crossed my mind. He may have forgotten, but the world remembered. Behind me, the cottage stood like a heartbeat made of wood and light. Quiet, patient, alive. I whispered into the fading sunlight, "You gave me a house, my son. You just didn't know you gave me my heart back, too." And then, as dusk fell over the hills, the phone in my bag buzzed softly. When I picked it up, Ethan's little voice filled the line, soft and worried. "Grandma, Daddy's crying. He said he lost you." I closed my eyes, the evening wind brushing my cheeks like a blessing. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "He hasn't lost me. He's just learning where to find me." The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows of the little cottage, dusting the room in warm gold. The air felt different here, clean, quiet, forgiving. I stood barefoot on the wooden floor, the boards creaking softly under my feet, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at home. Not just housed, home. I brewed tea on the old stove that still worked, the flame flickering blue and bright. As the kettle whistled, I smiled faintly. Even that sound, shrill, imperfect, alive, felt like music compared to the hushed perfection of Daniel's marble kitchen. I sat by the open window with my cup, watching the lake shimmer through the trees. It was calm, as if nothing in the world had ever gone wrong here. I breathed in the scent of wildflowers drifting through the air and whispered, "This is what peace feels like." For years I'd chased it through memories and regrets, but it had always been waiting here, in the things I thought I'd lost. Later that day, I began unpacking the boxes labeled Mom's Things. Each one was a time capsule, a memory wrapped in dust and patience. I found my old apron still carrying the faint scent of cinnamon, the chipped mug Daniel had given me when he got his first paycheck, a letter from my late husband, folded neatly inside a cookbook, his handwriting fading but still steady. "Our boy will make you proud someday." I smiled softly at that. He did, I thought, just not in the way I expected. Under another stack of boxes, I found a wooden jewelry case. Inside were little trinkets. Small gifts Daniel had made as a child. A clay heart, a lopsided bracelet, a note that said, "You're the best, Mom." I pressed it to my chest and whispered, "You were my best too once." The tears came, but this time they weren't bitter. They were cleansing. In the afternoon, I sat on the porch, painting the old rocking chair that had been left there. The brush moved slowly in my hand, rhythmically like a heartbeat. Every stroke felt like stitching a wound closed. As I painted, I thought of Ethan, his small, brave face, the way his voice had trembled when he told me his father was crying. I hoped Daniel was beginning to see what pride had cost him, but I didn't wish him pain anymore, only clarity, because I had learned something here. Sometimes the people who wound us the most are the ones who never learned how to face their own emptiness. And loving them means learning when to step away, not in anger, but in grace. By evening, the house glowed warmly with lamplight. I'd unpacked enough to make it feel alive again. A few photos on the mantel, my quilt draped over the couch, my tea set polished and ready. Then, as I was folding an old blanket, my phone buzzed again. Ethan's name flashed across the screen. My heart lifted. "Hello, my darling boy," I said, my voice brightening before I could stop it. "Grandma," his little voice rushed through the line. "Daddy told me to call you. He said he's sorry." I froze. "He did?" "Uh-huh," Ethan said quickly. "He said he made a big mistake. He's been crying a lot. Mommy told him to come see you." I smiled through the sudden sting in my eyes. "Is that so?" "Yeah, and I told him your house is so pretty in my drawings. He said maybe we can come visit." I laughed softly, a sound that felt new again, like the first breath after rain. "Well, you tell Daddy that my house is always open. There's room for everyone who remembers how to love." He giggled, not fully understanding, and then added, "Can I help paint when we come? Daddy says you like painting chairs." I looked at the half-painted rocking chair beside me. "You can paint all the chairs you want, sweetheart." After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, the phone still warm in my hand. The lake reflected the fading light, and the world turned quiet again, but it was a soft quiet. Not loneliness, just peace. I thought about Daniel's tears, about the boy he once was, the man he became, and the father he was still learning to be. Maybe this was the start of something new, not perfect, not easy, but real. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it transforms it. It turns pain into understanding, distance into perspective. And I was finally ready to let that transformation happen. That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in years. My handwriting shook a little, but the words came steady. Sometimes love doesn't return the way you gave it, but it returns. In time, in silence, in unexpected ways. I paused, then added one more line. If you can't find your place in someone else's world, build your own, and leave the door open for when they remember the way home. Before bed, I stepped outside one last time. The air was cool, the stars bright. Somewhere far off, a car passed on the main road, its headlights fading into the night. I wondered if Daniel was driving, if he was finally on his way, and though I didn't know for sure, I felt it. That quiet pull in a mother's heart when something long broken begins to mend. I whispered into the stillness, "Come home, son. Not to me, to yourself." Then I turned off the porch light, the lake shimmering gently beyond the trees, and went inside, no longer waiting, but ready. It was late afternoon when I heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel. I was in the garden behind the cottage, trimming the overgrown roses that had climbed up the fence, their thorns brushing against my gloves. For a moment, I thought it was the postman, but when I looked up, I froze. The same sleek black car that had brought me pain now stood at the edge of the driveway, sunlight glinting off its polished surface. The engine stopped. The door opened slowly. Daniel stepped out first, then Lydia, and from the back seat, Ethan clutching a bunch of wildflowers, smiling nervously. My heart stuttered. I wiped my hands on my apron, steadying myself. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't ready for this either. Some wounds need quiet, not apologies shouted over them. Yet, as they approached, I felt no bitterness, only the weight of years between us. "Mom," Daniel's voice cracked the way it used to when he was 12 and caught lying about broken glass. Only this time, the pieces were our lives. I stood still, watching him struggle for words. His tie was crooked, his eyes tired, the kind of tired that comes from guilt you can't sleep off. Lydia's hand rested gently on his arm. She looked different, too, softer, humbled, the kind of woman stripped of pretenses. And little Ethan, he ran forward first. "Grandma!" He threw his arms around my waist before anyone could stop him, his small body pressed against me with the kind of honesty adults forget. I bent down, hugging him tightly, inhaling the faint scent of soap and sunlight in his hair. "Hello, my darling boy," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You came." He grinned up at me, proud. "I brought you flowers. Daddy said I should pick the prettiest ones I could find." I took them gently from his hand, a messy bundle of daisies and clovers, and smiled through my tears. "They're perfect." Daniel finally stepped closer. His eyes flickered between the cottage, the lake, and me. "So this is it," he murmured, his voice thick. "The place I should have told you about." I nodded quietly. "It's beautiful, Daniel. It feels like home." He swallowed hard. "It should have been yours long ago. I bought it after my first big promotion. I wanted to surprise you, but then life got complicated. I told myself I'd give it to you when things looked better, when I'd built a name, when—" he exhaled sharply, "when I wasn't ashamed anymore." The words hung heavy between us, raw and fragile. I looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time, I didn't see the proud, polished man from Windsor Hills. I saw the boy who used to fall asleep with his head on my lap, the one who dreamed big because I told him he could. "Sit down, Daniel," I said, softly. "All of you. Let's talk." We sat on the porch. The air was cool, the lake shimmering like glass. Lydia took Ethan's hand while Daniel sat across from me, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. "I don't know how to start," he said quietly. "Start with the truth," I replied. "You owe that to both of us." He nodded slowly, tears already gathering. I thought success meant never looking back. I thought if I erased where I came from, people would finally see me as someone worth respecting. But the more I tried to hide, the emptier I felt. I told myself it was for my family, for Lydia, for Ethan. But I realize now I built a house of mirrors. Everything looked perfect, but none of it was real. His voice cracked. When you left, it was like someone turned off all the lights in my life. Lydia reached for his hand. "He's telling the truth," she said softly. "He's been trying to apologize since the day you walked out. He didn't know how." I sipped my tea quietly, letting the words settle. "You hurt me deeply, Daniel," I said at last, "not because you wanted more from life, but because you forgot that love doesn't make you smaller. It makes you whole. And you were willing to trade that for people who never even saw you." He wiped his eyes. "I know, I see that now. I don't know how to fix what I broke." "You don't fix it," I said gently. "You live better. You love louder. You teach your son never to do what you did." He nodded, his shoulders shaking. "I will, Mom, I promise." Ethan looked between us, confused but listening. "Daddy?" he asked softly. "Are you crying?" Daniel laughed through his tears. "Yeah, buddy. Grown-ups cry too sometimes." Ethan's eyes widened. "Did Grandma make you cry?" We all laughed, even Lydia. It was the first genuine sound of joy between us in years. I reached out and ruffled Ethan's hair. "No, sweetheart. Grandma helped him remember something important." "What's that?" "That love doesn't have to look perfect to be real." As the sun dipped lower, painting the lake in orange and gold, Daniel stood and walked to the edge of the porch. He turned back to me. "Can I come back sometimes? Maybe for dinner? Maybe help fix the roof?" I smiled faintly. "You don't have to ask, Daniel, but this time, when you come as my son, not as a guest." His eyes softened, his lips trembling into a small, broken smile. "Always, Mom." He crossed the porch and hugged me, truly hugged me, for the first time in years. Not the stiff, polite kind of embrace I'd grown used to, but the kind that speaks without words. I felt his shoulders shake, his tears dampening my shawl, and for the first time, I didn't think of what was lost, only what was found. As evening settled, Lydia helped me set the table for dinner. We ate simply. Bread, stew, laughter. Ethan told stories about school, Daniel listened instead of checking his phone, and Lydia smiled like a woman who'd finally let her guard down. When they left that night, Daniel kissed my forehead. "I'll come back soon," he said. I touched his cheek and whispered, "Just don't wait until you've built another house to remember who you are." He smiled through tears. "I won't." When their car disappeared down the lane, I stood under the stars, the cool air brushing against my face. The porch light flickered softly, the flowers Ethan had brought resting in a jar beside the door. For years, I'd begged life to give me peace. Tonight, it did. Not as perfection, but as truth. I whispered into the night, "You don't need to be seen by the world to matter. You just need to be remembered by the ones who once forgot you." The wind carried my words across the lake like a prayer finally set free. It's been a few weeks since that day, since Daniel stood on this porch, tears in his eyes, calling me Mom again without shame in his voice. Every morning now, I wake to the sound of the lake outside my window, the soft rhythm of water brushing the shore, the call of distant birds returning home. There's something healing in that sound. It reminds me that life, no matter how broken, always finds a way to move forward. The cottage has changed since then. It's no longer quiet and forgotten. There are fresh flowers on the windowsill, the ones Ethan and I planted together. There's a new rocking chair beside mine for when Daniel visits. And Lydia, bless her heart, has started sending recipes, asking for the ones I used to make when Daniel was a boy. Sometimes I catch myself smiling for no reason at all, because for the first time in years, my heart doesn't ache from being unseen. It beats quietly with something softer. Peace. Daniel has been coming every weekend. At first, he arrived nervous, still walking on eggshells, as if afraid one wrong word would shatter the fragile bridge between us. But slowly I've seen him change. He lingers longer. He laughs easier. He helps around the garden, teaching Ethan how to hammer nails while I watch from the porch, my tea warm in my hands. And once, when he thought I wasn't listening, I heard him tell Ethan, "You know, your grandma built everything I have. I just forgot to thank her." That sentence alone could have carried me through another lifetime. Sometimes, when Daniel and Lydia leave and the cottage returns to its quiet hum, I sit by the window and think about everything that's happened. People often think betrayal is loud, like shouting, slamming doors, angry words thrown in the heat of the moment. But the worst kind of betrayal is quiet. It's the silence when someone you love pretends you're invisible. It's watching your name fade from their stories. That's the kind of pain I carried across states, across years. But here, in this little wooden house surrounded by everything he once tried to bury, I found the antidote. Not revenge, not pity, just self-respect. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is walk away without hate. One evening, Daniel asked if I'd ever come back to live closer to them again. I smiled and shook my head. "This is where I belong," I told him. "This house, these walls, they don't ask me to be anyone else." He looked around the cottage and nodded, almost tearful. "It suits you," he said. "It does," I whispered, "because I don't need to fit in anymore. I just need to be." The sun was setting then, golden light spilling across the lake like honey. Ethan ran barefoot through the grass, chasing fireflies, while Lydia called after him with laughter in her voice. Daniel sat beside me on the porch, quiet, humbled. And in that silence, that beautiful, wordless peace, I realized something. Sometimes motherhood isn't about holding on. It's about teaching them enough love that they can find their way back when they lose themselves. Daniel had wandered far, but he had found his way back, not just to me, but to himself. Now, as I sit here writing these words in my old journal, I can hear the night settling in, crickets humming, wind brushing through the trees, the soft ticking of the clock beside my chair. The air smells faintly of lavender and wood smoke. My teacup sits half empty on the table, cooling slowly, and I think of everything that's happened. The flight across the country, the whispered words that shattered me, the shame, the silence, the rediscovery of this cottage, and finally, the forgiveness. If someone had told me then that heartbreak could lead me here to peace, to purpose, to dignity, I might not have believed them, but now I know. Sometimes the things that break us are the very things that rebuild us stronger. So if anyone's listening, if any mother or daughter or woman out there has ever been told she's too much or too old or not good enough, hear me when I say this. You are none of those things. You are the roots that made someone else's wings possible. And even if they forget for a while, life has a way of reminding them who gave them their first flight. I lean back in my chair, the stars glimmering above the lake. I whisper softly to the night, He once told me not to tell the neighbors I was his mother, but now the whole town knows. I raised a man who finally remembered. And with that, I close my eyes, letting the gentle sound of the water carry my thoughts away, not into the past, but into peace,